Why don't we get started? Welcome, everyone. I'm Eric Rubin, president of AFSA, and I am very glad to welcome you all today for the 30th event in our AFSA Book Notes series. And today, we are very glad to welcome retired Foreign Service Officer Peter Cozzens to discuss his new book, Tecumseh and the Prophet, the Shawnee Brothers Who Defied a Nation. As a lover of history, as I'm sure many of you are, I'm very interested in today's discussion. I know many of you have studied history, and in conjunction with our foreign service careers, it's been a really important part of understanding our work and the context in our country's history and the world's history. So this kind of thing just really gets me very excited, especially at a time when we've had so many dismaying and distracting things going on in our lives for the past year plus. I'm really glad to have this opportunity. And I'm really glad we can continue the book note series. Just a pitch before I turn over the reins to say if anyone out there is an author or knows a Foreign Service author, please let us know. Please email member@afsa.org. And we want to keep this series going, help highlight some of the great work that our current and former colleagues are doing, and use the miracles of Zoom technology to do so and reach out all over the world. And I'm glad to see so many familiar names and faces today. So thank you. Today's moderator for our book talk is my fellow AFSA board member, Maria Hart. And I want to thank Maria for doing this and for agreeing to be our moderator. I'm really looking forward to the presentation. And with that, I'll hand over to Maria for the program. Thank you everyone again for coming, and let's get started.
Great, thank you, Eric, and welcome everyone. I'm so excited to do this. I will tell you, this is really a good read. It's an intense read. Some things I had to read over again to just get into the overall gist of all that Peter put on these pages. And so just to introduce Mr. Peter Cozzens, he's the author editor of 17 acclaimed books on American Civil War and Indian Wars of the American West. In 2002, he was awarded the American Foreign Service Association highest honor, the William R. Rifkin Award, given annually to one Foreign Service officer for exemplary morale, courage, integrity, and creative dissent. Prior to embarking on his Foreign Service career, Mr. Cozzens served as a captain in the U.S. Army. He lives in Kensington, Maryland. Just so you know, this is his second book. His first book, The Earth is Weeping, is available in vintage paperback. Thank you for coming, and welcome, Peter.
Well, thanks so much, Maria.
So let's get started. I want to, as I mentioned to you earlier, I tell you, I was able to pull like so many questions. I ended up with almost 60 different points noted in this book. And there were just parts of it I couldn't put, like I said, I had to reread them, and I saw various aspects as turning points. But I wanted to ask you, does the first book, The Earth is Weeping, tie into this second book, Tecumseh and the Prophet?
It does, and in a way, it's sort of backwards chronologically. I wrote The Earth is Weeping because I wanted to present an objective and I hope definitive story of the Indian Wars of the American West, which, of course, when we think of conflict between the United States government and Native Americans, we naturally gravitate to the American West. But when I concluded that book, I realized that a great deal happened east of the Mississippi River that had in some ways a far greater impact on the settlement of the United States than what happened in the West, and certainly was a precursor to that. And if events had turned out differently, the settlement of the West may have been delayed. It may have looked very different than it did. And so I gravitated naturally to the what was called the Old Northwest, today's Midwest, and Ohio Valley and Upper Great Lakes region, because it was there really, and that struggle for America's heartland is really where the Native Americans' fate was decided. If things had turned out differently in the struggles that Tecumseh and his brother, the Shawnee Prophet, had with the Americans, and they very well could have turned out differently, then the map of the Midwest may have looked very different, and certainly the settlement of the West would have looked different. And so it's necessary really to look at what happened east of the Mississippi to have a fuller understanding of the Indian Wars in the American West. And in fact, I've just completed a third book in this what I call a trilogy, even though it's chronologically backwards. I've just completed a book on the Creek War and Andrew Jackson, really the crucial struggle for the American South. So when that is published, I will have essentially covered all the geographical ground in the struggles between the U.S. government and Western immigrants and Native Americans.
So you list in your book, like I said, a plethora of tribes, many of which I think some of us have never heard of or that have expired since, for some time. And so why Tecumseh in particular and his brother, of all the tribes you could have focused on, of all the chiefs you could have looked at, why Tecumseh?
Well, Tecumseh is acknowledged by many historians and as the quintessential, perhaps the greatest American Indian political and military leader in history. He and his brother Tenskwatawa, who was known as a Shawnee Prophet at the time by whites, he was without a doubt the most influential Indian prophet. And prophets or seers were very important in Native American culture. I mean, they obtained the same level of respect and deference from people as did war leaders like Tecumseh. And it's even more incredible that you have the most influential Indian military and political leader, Tecumseh, and the most influential Indian prophet as brothers. It's really quite remarkable, and really, as I say in my preface, giving Native Americans their due, these two not only were the most influential brothers in American Indian history, but also really two of the most influential brothers in American history writ large. And at the apex of the alliance they created, they mustered, just by way of comparison to the American West, they mustered more supporters, more warriors, more male fighting men, nearly 3 times as many as the largest Indian alliance in the West, which essentially was at the Little Bighorn, 3 times as many warriors as Sitting Bull and Crazy Horse mustered at the Little Bighorn. So their impact was outsized, and they drew followers from over a dozen different tribes, spanning from the modern Southeast all the way to the northern reaches of the Mississippi River in Minnesota. They had an incredible reach.
Yeah, it's definitely laid out in the book, the campaigns, and also to how they divided up responsibilities, which will then lend me to the next question, the relationship in all of this. Expand a little bit more on how the two of them work together in making this happen. Yes, as you mentioned, we all heard of the Battle of Little Bighorn, but a lot of we've never heard, at least I hadn't heard of many of the skirmishes that Tecumseh and Tenskwatawa endured. So explain though a little bit more about their relationship.
Sure, and I'll preface that by saying it's really fascinating. I hadn't fully appreciated this, but the clashes between Indians and the U.S. military in the modern Midwest were generally larger and bloodier than anything that occurred in the West. in 1791, the first battle in which Tecumseh, as a very young man, participated, commonly called St. Clair's defeat, almost the entire standing United States Army, which was quite small, was wiped out in a single battle, with Indians who would later, tribes who would later form part of Tecumseh and Tenskwatawa's alliance. 800 soldiers killed in a single battle, which is almost as many as were killed in all the Indian wars in the American West. So the level of violence was far greater in this area than in the American West, which is kind of runs counter to popular belief. But as for the relationship, it really was fascinating, and I enjoyed writing this book because I was able to I had the material available to really flesh them out as human beings. Everything from, not trying to psychoanalyze them, everything from their sex life to their relationships with white people, and really flesh them out as human beings. And that was one of the most enjoyable parts of the book. But they were really polar opposites. They were both the sons of a famed Shawnee war leader who was killed when Tecumseh was only about he was only 6 years old, and Tenskwatawa was still in his mother's womb when their father was killed. And they were polar opposites. Tecumseh, right from the get-go, as a child, he was charismatic. He was a natural leader. He had a large gang of fellow Indian boys, Shawnee boys, who would follow him around in mock battles. He was, as he grew up, he became, a renowned hunter, just a natural, charismatic leader. He was handsome. He was almost 6 feet tall, very strong. Tenskwatawa, on the other hand, he was one of three. He was born of triplets, and triplets were considered to be an evil omen in most Eastern woodland Indian cultures. So he had that strike against him, right out of the womb, so to speak. But he was kind of a misfit. He was completely inept when it came to hunting and war making, which were the two most critical tasks by which an Indian man or boy was judged. When he was still a youth, he was so inept that he shot his right eye out with an arrow. I still can't figure out how he did that, but he managed to do that. And by the time he was in his late teens, he was an inebriate, a seemingly unredeemable alcoholic and alcoholism was, as I explained in the book, was one of the key factors in weakening the tribes, both morally and physically in the Midwest. He tried his hand at medicine, that is to say, at native cures as a native healer. Wasn't very good at that. He essentially sponged off Tecumseh and also off his elder sister and her husband. I mean, a complete layabout, ne'er-do-well, alcoholic. I would say he was a wife abuser, but actually one of his two wives abused him more than the other way around. So they were just absolutely complete polar opposites until Tenskwatawa had this remarkable vision that I impart in the book, and to me is quite remarkable. He has this prophetic vision. He falls into a trance, almost like a cataleptic state. In fact, Tecumseh and his friends and family thought he was dead, and he emerged from this 2 days later and a completely changed man, never took a drop of liquor again in his life, and became this eloquent spokesman for a revival of traditional Indian culture and a rejection of everything American, trade goods, intermarriage, the whole bits. And then they found, at that point, Tecumseh and Tenskwatawa found common ground in the desire to bring the Indians together as one people.
I'm going to backtrack a bit because I actually wanted to ask you this first. Your writing process, which chapter did you write first? Because, normally most writers don't always write in a linear fashion. So which chapter did you write first? But also going back, how did you go about your research process and pulling documents and pulling all of this together for this incredible book?
Well, I did write from a linear fashion. I think, and when you're writing biography, and this, of course, is not merely a dual biography, which presents a challenge in itself, because you're trying to balance the lives of two men. But it's also what you call a life in time. So I'm telling the larger story of the loss of the Midwest by the Indians, to white American encroachment. And when I use the term white, I'm speaking, in the language of the day, any non-Indian. And no, I wrote it in linear fashion. This was a much more difficult book to research than The Earth is Weeping, because as you progress farther back in Native American history, there are obviously fewer sources. And in the case of Earth is Weeping, the mid to late 19th century, there were no shortage of accounts that were imparted by Native American participants to either white ethnologists or even testimony before Congress, or their own memoirs that they dictated and were translated. But the farther back you go, the harder it becomes. For me, I relied very heavily on documents from the British archives, because Tecumseh and the Prophet were very close to the British and British Canada. In fact, the climax of the book is the War of 1812 and their alliance with the British against the Americans. And also many accounts by whites who were either held captive or were adopted into the various tribes of the Midwest, and who left their accounts of their times with the Indians. And apropos of that, and to show you how fluid frontier society was, the best source I had when I was researching the lives of Tecumseh and his brother as young men was an account written by a Kentuckian named Stephen Riddell, who was captured in a Shawnee and British raid on his Kentucky home at age 12. And at the time, Tecumseh was also 12, and he and Tecumseh became fast friends, and Riddell remained with Tecumseh for the next 17 or 18 years and fought with Tecumseh against white settlers, which was not uncommon to have, adopted white men fighting against their fellow whites. And he, after 18 years, he decided he wanted to return to Kentucky society, and Tecumseh bid him a sad but fond farewell. And he wrote an extensive memoir that's very reliable about his early days with Tecumseh. So those are some of the sources that I drew upon. And of course, contemporaneous newspapers and things like that. And but it was much more of a challenge than it was for my previous book on Native American history.
I'd like you to expand a bit more about the Shawnee adoption process, because there are quite a few violent skirmishes in the book, and you are quite descriptive in how some of the Indian warriors would, deal with some of the captors. But on a softer side, explain the adoption process and how it worked in the Shawnee culture.
Right. Before I do that, thank you, Francis, for putting this slide up. This is a Tecumseh depiction of Tecumseh holding a British trade musket, and that was done actually by a modern artist. I think it's a very good depiction of Tecumseh. There are no contemporaneous paintings of him. There's one sketch by a French American trader, and everything is kind of derived from that. Tenskwatawa, who you see on the other side here, this is a a watercolor done by the famous artist James Catlin. It was a watercolor sketch he did from life of Tenskwatawa later in life. And Tenskwatawa sat for numerous portraits. So we have a real good idea of what he looked like. And this is probably the best depiction. As you can see, he's kind of turned so you're not able to see his blinded right eye. He's showing his good side. And if you could show the next slide, Francis, the slide of the Shawnee Warriors. This is what what Shawnees looked like in the late 18th century, early 19th century. This was the typical Eastern woodland Indian looked like. And so if you were falling captive to the Shawnees, these are what the men you confronted would have looked like. The adoption process was very markedly different between tribes east of the Mississippi and those in the American West. Generally, if you were a man and you came into conflict in the West with Indians and you weren't captured, you were killed. You weren't tortured, with the exception of 2 or 3 tribes. You were killed on the spot. And if you were a woman, quite frankly, you could expect to be gang raped and then either adopted into the tribe or killed. Young children were often adopted into the tribes. It was a very different situation with the Shawnee and with the other tribes of the Midwest. They routinely adopted children into the tribes. They particularly like to adopt boys to replenish the ranks of warriors, because remember, these tribes were not large and they couldn't afford to take heavy losses the way the army could or the way settlers could. Women were never raped by the Shawnee or other tribes. They considered it religiously anathema to do that, because they felt that the power, so to speak, divine power that women possessed, which was very different from that of men, would somehow cause them to lose their power to make war. And their power as hunters and warriors if they were to do that. And they would also quite frequently adopt men who were captured, which is something the Indians in the West never did. If you were captured by a Eastern woodland warrior, be he Shawnee or Potawatomi or Chippewa, whatever, it was the right of the individual warrior who captured you to decide your fate, whether you would become a captive and then either be ransomed or adopted into the tribe, or whether you would be tortured and put to death. Most often, fortunately for those captured, you were adopted into the tribe. And the Eastern Woodland Indians were not by any means racist. What they would do is, if they captured a white man or a black man, they would put them through a series of religious ceremonies. They would, cut their hair. They would bathe them in a ceremony. They would, pluck their beard and various things to convert them into Native Americans like themselves. And they believe that once the captive, again, white or black, went through this ritual, he was a full member of the tribe, entitled to all the rights and privileges of members of the tribe. And so by the time of Tecumseh's life, I would say probably maybe 1 in 10 or 15 members of any given tribe were former captives.
Yeah, it's quite a process.
Yeah.
So, I was touched by that, actually. So we have Tecumseh, the Americans, the British, and the wampum belt. So explain the relationship and its overall successes as well as failures in the pursuit of independence, conflict and war, as well as encroachment. But also I just noticed the value that was placed on this particular item called the wampum belt. So could you talk about that, please?
Okay, to give you an idea of the scope of action here and American encroachment. Let's go to the next slide. The principal opponent of Tecumseh and Tenskwatawa was this gentleman, William Henry Harrison, who most of us know as the shortest lived president in American history. But actually in the early 19th century, he was a towering figure in America. As in his late 20s, he was appointed by John Adams as the governor of the Indiana Territory, which at that time included Ohio, modern-day Ohio, Indiana, Wisconsin, Illinois, and Illinois. I mean, it was a huge bailiwick that he had initially. Eventually, Ohio was carved off as a state. Michigan was carved off as a territory, as was Illinois. But in his early years as governor of this territory, he was charged by President Thomas Jefferson with essentially acquiring all the Indian land he could, short of causing war, to enable the growth of what Jefferson called his empire of liberty. That is to say, to give more room for settlement by yeoman farmers who were becoming kind of crunched on the Atlantic seaboard as the American population grew. And Jefferson envisioned, settling the American country all the way to the Mississippi River with small farmers, and at the same time, to make way for that, to somehow, in the parlance of the day, civilize, Christianize the Indians, turn them into full-time yeoman farmers so they would be willing to part with their land. And if that didn't do it, by means of trade through American government-run trading houses, drive them so deeply into debt that they would be compelled to sell their land in order to fulfill their debts to the United States. And Harrison was responsible for a series of treaties that chipped away at most of Ohio, Illinois, at least on paper, as well as the better part of Indiana. And it was Harrison and his treaties that caused Tenskwatawa's alliance, which initially was an alliance that brought together Indians from disparate tribes to try to achieve a cultural renewal, religious renewal, because Tenskwatawa said that the God, the master of life, had told him that it was really the Indians' fault, that they had strayed from the ideal way of life. They had strayed from the master of life's teachings, and they were responsible in no small measure for the fate that was befalling them. And it was these land treaties and encroachment that gave Tecumseh his appeal, which was to unite all the Indian tribes in the Midwest as one people with one common destiny, and to make no treaties with the Americans separately, but to resist American encroachment, to acknowledge and accept what had happened, but not to permit any more American encroachment, and to unite as one people against the Americans. And he knew, however, he was very pragmatic. He knew that could not be done without British assistance. And the British had long been sort of fickle allies of the Indians in the Midwest, because they wanted a barrier, an Indian barrier, between the growing United States and British Canada. And in the War of 1812, they finally made fully common cause in fighting the Americans. So that's sort of the scope of the action in the book. Wampum belts are interesting. The Indians, wampum it was made from various things. Initially, wampum was made from seashells, later on from beads obtained from British or American traders. And they were woven into these intricate belts that had different meanings. And a Native American could tell the meaning of the wampum belt by the colors, by the arrangement of patterns. For instance, if a belt, and when you were calling on other tribes to either go to war or for a peace council, you would send out wampum belts. And the most famous wampum belt was kept by one of the allied tribes of Tecumseh the Prophet, the Wyandots. And it was this large belt that was white, largely white, which was the color of peace. And it had symbols indicating the British on one end, the Indians on the other, and a kind of a heart in the middle. And that indicated that, you know, this was an alliance that couldn't or shouldn't be broken. And then you had black wampum belts that were also had smaller designs within that were calls to war.
Mm-hmm.
And then the Indians also would use small wampum belts as kind of as like we would use note cards when speaking, and they would use them as pneumatic devices. And so certain color patterns would remind them of things that they had to or needed to say in council. And they would kind of hold these wampum belts at their side and, you know, sort of feel their way through their talks as they were giving them.
Yeah, I thought that was kind of interesting.
It's cool. It's very cool. Yeah.
Yeah, it was very cool. And the significance of it, like a lot of things did not take place until this wampum belt was actually the precursor. And
exactly.
So, yeah.
Open councils, right?
Open councils, yes. So like, speaking of councils of which so we mentioned before about the use or the word confederacy and how you used it with this particular book and storyline, because I think most of us, like I said, are more accustomed to that term being used, just Confederacy by itself, referring to the Union versus the South.
Right, with a capital C, right.
With a capital C, yes. So, but looking at that and how it all came together, Tecumseh did try, despite the various successes that they did have in the large mass of Indian warriors that did come out for the various campaigns. But it seemed like towards the end, he just kind of missed the mark on like bringing everyone together, especially when he went down to the South right. to expand the campaigning and bring on supporters. So it seemed like he never was fully able at some point to bring everyone together. What do you think contributed to those failed attempts on trying to fully align all of the tribes and get everyone on board towards the end?
Well, you know, in the course of Native American / U.S. history, there was never, east of Mississippi or in the West, never a single tribe that was fully united against American encroachment. There were always war versus accommodationist factions, traditionalist versus assimilationist factions, all across the board. And that was the case in the Midwest as well. And that stemmed from a number of causes. One, Indian society was extraordinarily democratic. Indian war leaders, political leaders, chiefs, they did not possess any institutional powers of coercion or powers to compel members of a tribe or other tribes that might join with them to follow their guidance, to follow their leadership. Native Americans would follow leaders so long as they respected them, so long as they shared beliefs with them, and no longer. So it's really a tribute, actually, to Tecumseh's and Tenskwatawa's charisma and the power of their messages that they were able to, at their peak, bring together 6,000 warriors and their families from, like I said, over a dozen disparate tribes. When even within a single tribe, it was hard for a chief to keep his people together, and that's one of the reasons why I use the term Confederacy, because the Confederacy, and other historians have as well, connotes a loose assemblage of be it states, or in this case tribes, or portions of tribes, just like under the United States, under the Articles of Confederacy, was a loose association of states that more or less, kind of the states went their own way as it suited their interests. Is very much more the case with Indian tribes. And so I think that's the most effective way to describe this assemblage of Indians. And it's remarkable too, and a kind of an extreme example of this, that Tecumseh and his brother, although they were Shawnee, at the time at which they reached kind of the apex of their influence, during the War of 1812, there were only about 1,000 Shawnees still residing in the Midwest. Nearly half the tribe had long since immigrated west of Mississippi, had decided, again, this is a good example of how Indians made their own decisions, had decided to migrate into what was then first Spanish land and then French land west of the Mississippi and take advantage of Spanish land grants rather than fight the Americans. And even Tecumseh and Tenskwatawa's mother, when they were still boys, joined this migration and left them to be raised by their elder sister, which could only have been a really traumatic event. And I speculate that in the book, in the book. But among the Shawnees, Tecumseh and his brother only enjoyed the support of about 10% of the Shawnee. The majority of Shawnee had decided to follow the accommodationist path and try to become the yeoman farmers that Jefferson would have them be. They gained most of their support from tribes that had not yet fully felt the deleterious effects of direct contact with American settlers in large numbers. Tribes that were kind of on the periphery, like in the periphery then was Wisconsin, Michigan, and Illinois. But they sort of, I guess, through the example of their brother tribes in Ohio and northern Indiana, sort of saw the handwriting on the wall if they didn't join in an alliance. And those tribes were much more unified in their resistance than were tribes that were already sort of, more spiritually and morally and physically broken down by long-term contact with Americans.
Okay, well, I do have one more question, but I do want to give other people a chance to ping you. But I'm going to ask you about the untimely death of Tecumseh and how that impacted Tenskwatawa and the overall movement, and how it may be stymied, or how did that impact the overall movement, his untimely death?
Tecumseh's death killed it. It really, it truly killed it. He went from within a period of actually, the British were for nearly a year, actually for a little over a year, the British and Tecumseh's alliance controlled all of Michigan. They beat the only American army of consequence in the Midwest at the Battle of Detroit, and they essentially controlled all of Michigan and a bit of northern Indiana and a bit of northern Ohio as well. And had the British and their Indian allies prevailed, the British had promised Tecumseh and Tenskwatawa that they would grant them a kind of the homeland that the Indians sought, which most likely would have been modern day Michigan. And had the situation been a little different, and there were various opportunities, as I explained in the book, when things could have gone fully the British and Indians' way, and history could have been very much changed. But once they were unable to dislodge the Americans from Ohio, the Battle of Lake Erie occurs, the British lose their supply line into the interior of Canada and are forced to withdraw from Michigan into Canada. Suddenly the Indian alliance, this is a good example of how the Native Americans would basically decide for themselves. Tenskwatawa's alliance starts to crumble, goes from 6,000 warriors to the time of Tecumseh's death at the Battle of the Thames in Ontario, Canada. It had shrunk to just 500 warriors. When he's killed at the Battle of the Thames, it shrinks even further, and Tenskwatawa is left with maybe 200 or 300 warrior adherents and their families, and he's unable to provide the unifying force that Tecumseh did, and they become dependent upon British largesse, such as it was, for sustenance and even to stay alive for a number of years thereafter. So with Tecumseh's death, the Native Americans ceased to be a factor of consequence in the Midwest, and which then, of course, opened the door to westward settlement. So that was a turning point. Tenskwatawa did live for another nearly 25 years after Tecumseh's death, and that's the subject of the last chapter of my book. And to me, in many ways, it's the most poignant chapter to see how his life and that of his followers and other Indians in the Midwest devolved after Tecumseh's death. I don't want to spoil it by saying much more, but it's really a poignant story of what happens to them in the 2.5 decades afterward.
Well, I won't spoil it, but now we will. But thank you. And so now I'd like to open the floor to questions, comments.
Thank you, Maria. Please type your questions into the chat box. We will get to as many as possible. We already have a few, so let's just. First question is if one wanted to follow Tecumseh's historical trail, where would one travel to?
That's a very good question. And one of the problems that I faced that I did not face in The Earth is Weeping. In Earth is Weeping, I spent a total of altogether about 2 months in the American West, visiting almost every site of a battle or skirmish. And out west, a lot of these sites are on private ranch land or otherwise in almost pristine condition. A lot of the sites that Tecumseh strode, a lot of the sites of skirmishes and battles in the Midwest had been overtaken by development. His birth site, for instance, outside of Chillicothe, Ohio, has now been overtaken by urban development. But most of the significant sites in his life, well, I should say some of the more significant sites you can still visit. The site of the Battle of Tippecanoe, which was an important battle in their resistance of American encroachment, still exists in Ohio. It's a park. Prophetstown, which was their home village for most of their alliance, has been partially reconstructed adjacent to the Battle of Tippecanoe site in Indiana. That's well worth a visit. The Battle of Fort Meigs, a major action in which Tecumseh took part with the British in the War of 1812. The fort itself, a 2-acre large fort, has been reconstructed and restored. It's just outside of Toledo. It's absolutely fascinating. I think the finest example of a reconstructed frontier fort. The site of the Battle of the Thames, on the other hand, in Ontario, which was then all forest and swamp, is now a combination of vineyards and cornfields. And so thus much of the ground has been altered. I was able to find the site of 2 of his skirmishes with Kentucky militiamen on the border of the Ohio River through a combination of accounts and crude maps left by Kentuckians and good old Google Maps, and was able to locate those. But for the most part, it's not, you really can't travel Tecumseh's ground like you can the ground trodden by the tribes in the American West. So it's an unfortunate reality of development.
Thank you. Next question is, can you please comment on the role of territorial competition in the inter-Indian rivalries of the pre-1790 period? Was raiding designed to acquire territory as well as goods?
That's a really good question. That's a very good question. And it's an interesting phenomenon that, again, you have this dichotomy between the tribes east of the Mississippi and those to the west. I haven't even discussed the tribes south of the Ohio River, the Choctaw, Chickasaw, Cherokee, and Creek tribes, which will actually be the subject of my next book. But the tribes west of the Mississippi generally continued intertribal warfare and raiding for the purposes of obtaining buffalo hunting grounds, of obtaining war trophies like scalps. They continued that practice even into the mid to late 1800s, while they were fighting the U.S. Army on one hand. Many of these tribes were also fighting one another, and that phenomenon never ended. On the contrary, the tribes in the east of Mississippi the tribes that are involved in this book were mostly Algonquin-speaking tribes. They were generally small. Individual tribes were never more than 5,000 or 6,000, and generally claimed for themselves a hunting and not combination of hunting and agricultural land, because they practiced both, far larger than they really needed. And they tended to get along very well. And what the warfare among the tribes that formed Tecumseh's alliance, even before Tecumseh came on the scene, it was limited at best. And it was largely limited to maybe stealing horses from one another, maybe in some instances stealing potential wives, stealing women. Very seldom was it bloody. The bloodiest wars that involved these tribes were actually in the mid to late 1600s, when the tribes of the Iroquois Confederacy in what is now modern New York and southern eastern Canada raided into the Ohio Valley and really tore apart these tribes and conquered the Ohio Valley for a number of years. In fact, that caused a diaspora for many years of the Shawnee. But by the mid 1700s, the tribes in the Midwest were pretty much living in harmony. They had shared cultural, religious values. Again, they had plenty of land until white American encroachment led to a depletion of not only land but also of the deer upon which they relied for much of their sustenance. So it was much easier for them to come together as allies than it was for tribes in the West to ever do. They had much more in common, and they were, although again, young men were judged by their ability as warriors, they were more judged by their ability as hunters and providers. Warfare was much less common, intertribal warfare.
Thank you. The next question. Hi, Peter, great book. I'm interested in your writing process. How did you manage what must have been a mountain of material and translate it into your prose? Did you work from a detailed outline, or did you know the material so well you could spool out the text and go back later to add or adjust?
No, I tend to be pretty methodical. I will, like in the case of Tecumseh and the Prophet, there wasn't much, surprisingly little written about the Prophet, despite him being the one that created this alliance in the first place, and being again the most influential Indian prophet in American history. I think that's partly because his creed, his doctrine, was so foreign to whites at the time. But I read the best secondary sources I could, not only on Tecumseh and Tenskwatawa, but also on in general, that period of American history in the Midwest. And 6 or 7 of the best books, I assimilated those, and then I kind of scratched out an outline based on that, and based on a sense of what primary sources I would be able to gather, an extensive outline. And in doing my research, I would sort of key it off that outline, and as I obtained primary source material, I would fit it into the outline or modify the outline as necessary to accommodate the sources to where they might lead me. So I was a fairly methodical process, but there were times in the course of writing the book where I would shift stuff around and maybe combine chapters. But one of the necessities of working with a major trade publisher like Alfred A. Knopf, which is one of the premier publishers in New York, or with any New York trade house, major publishing house, the agent with whom you work, and then the editor ultimately with whom you work, insist on seeing a very, very expansive proposal before you're able to obtain a contract for a book. So in the case of all 3 of my books with Knopf, these first 2, and then my forthcoming book, I had to present a 75-page proposal that included not only an outline of the book, but a kind of a snapshot of 3 or 4 paragraphs of each chapter, and also a sample chapter. So by the time I secured my contract, I had put things sufficiently together that I more or less knew where I was going in the course of my writing. But I always start with a as fulsome an outline as I can, and try to be methodical, almost as if I were writing a reporting cable. Just gather my materials and then methodically go through them. Inspiration and sources that you don't expect to find can change things in the course of the writing, but it's pretty much a linear process, and I generally followed the course of my proposal and didn't find myself deviating too much from that. But it's a methodical, linear process. I devote 8 hours a day to writing. And that, I think, is the key to any sort of writing, is to be disciplined. I mean, there's some days when I might sit at the computer and only knock out a couple paragraphs, and want to throw the computer against the wall because the words weren't coming. And then the next day, all of a sudden, things would just flow, and they would kind of process themselves overnight. And so I think it's really important not to wait for inspiration. If you do that, you may never finish a book, but just sit down and be disciplined in your approach to research and writing, and just treat it like a normal job, and set aside a definite working schedule.
Thank you. Next question is, could you explain a bit Tenskwatawa's religious movement and how it played into Tecumseh's recruitment of tribal allies? Yeah,
that is actually, the kind of maybe the crux of the book, and certainly to me the most fascinating. Tecumseh emerged from his first vision, from having spoken with the Master of Life, and then subsequent visions that occurred shortly thereafter, with a creed, a dogma that essentially called for, it recognized that all Indians were one people. Prior to that, different tribes were negotiating with William Henry Harrison, the bogeyman in the book, individually, selling off lands piecemeal, sometimes that didn't even belong to them. I mean, Harrison was very adroit at bringing in chiefs who were malleable, either by bribes or by whiskey, and getting them to sell off lands that didn't even necessarily belong to their tribe. And what Tenskwatawa says, look, we're one people. We need to abstain from alcohol, which was really just absolutely decimating Indian villages. This is beyond belief. Refrain from alcohol, refrain from white, American foodstuffs, refrain from any contact with Americans as being deleterious, to our way of life. Not all whites. I mean, in Tenskwatawa's scheme of things, the British and the French were all right, but the Americans were creatures of the evil spirit, of evil elements, and they must be kept at arm's length. And by returning to a pure way of life, to a more traditional Indian way of life, Tenskwatawa preached that the Master of Life would return the Indians to a almost an Eden-like state. The deer that becomes so scarce would reappear, and at some undefined point in the future, Americans would suddenly disappear in a great cataclysmic upheaval, and the Native Americans would enjoy the way of life that they had before Americans appeared on the scene. Obviously, that didn't come to pass, but Tenskwatawa was sufficiently charismatic and predicted a natural phenomenon that was so astounding. He predicted an eclipse of the sun right down to the minute. That's a whole story in itself, that he was able to attract a strong core of adherents. But as encroachment on Indian lands grew, Tecumseh transformed himself from a mere acolyte of Tenskwatawa into the foremost leader among those Indians who wanted to resist further encroachment through the power of his not only of his own oratory and charisma and fighting skills, but also by incorporating Tecumseh's doctrine. And the two of them joined forces and combined their beliefs into one strong doctrine that attracted a lot more adherents than either one individually might have. But ultimately, Tecumseh, as we get to approach the War of 1812, became he never fully supplanted Tenskwatawa, but he became the overarching figure in their alliance.
Thank you. Next question. Is it known if the prophet's two fellow triplets also survived?
And no, actually, it is known that one of them died just after birth, which actually played in Tenskwatawa's favor, because he was no longer one of three triplets. So that evil was gone. He had a twin brother who never became particularly distinguished, was just a common warrior, so to speak. Never aspired to anything, any sort of greatness within the tribe. So that phenomenon didn't last much beyond their birth.
Thank you. Our next questioner is wondering whether you know if there's any reason why William Tecumseh Sherman was given that specific middle name.
Yeah, that's a fantastic question. His birth name, actually, his father named him Tecumseh Sherman, not William Tecumseh Sherman, just Tecumseh. And as a boy, he was known as Cump. And he was born only about approximately two decades after Tecumseh's death. But Tecumseh was already revered by Americans in the Midwest. He'd become a heroic figure. And in fact, even during the War of 1812, when the Americans were actively fighting the British and Tecumseh's alliance, he was already widely regarded as a heroic figure. And that stemmed from an incident at the Battle of Fort Meigs, again, a major battle between the Americans and the British and their Indian allies, in which 900 ill-trained and poorly led Kentucky volunteers stumbled into an Indian ambush. And Tecumseh was on a different part of the battlefield when the majority of the surviving Kentuckians, about 600, were taken prisoners by the Indians. They were herded into the remains of an old British fort nearby, and a number of Indian war leaders systematically began to slaughter the Kentuckians, and even killed a couple of British guards who tried to prevent that. So you had this emerging slaughter of 600 Kentuckians who were crammed together, shoulder to shoulder in this broken down old fort, and they're being hacked to death and butchered. And word gets to Tecumseh, and he rides into the remains of this fort. He's furious because Tecumseh never believed in torture or of prisoners. He found that abhorrent, and he rode into this broken down stockade, and literally with a combination of his pipe tomahawk and by his words, shamed the Indians who were perpetrating this massacre into desisting and breaking off. And enough of the Kentuckians who survived, and the majority did survive, and were then within a matter of months exchanged for British prisoners and returned to their homes in Kentucky. Enough of them recognized Tecumseh to tell the story of his having saved their lives, that is spread throughout the press, not only of Kentucky, but throughout the country, that here's this Indian war leader who came and saved the lives of all these Americans, and he fights in a way that we can understand. He abides by the Western rules of war. and he becomes a heroic figure. And that, of course, grew as his legend grew after his death. And so by the 1830s, when Sherman was born, he was highly regarded. And William Tecumseh Sherman wasn't the only boy born in frontier Ohio and elsewhere who was given the name Tecumseh. It was also even more widely given to to male children in Canada for his action in helping preserve Canada against American invasion in the War of 1812. So it's not at all surprising that his father named him Tecumseh.
Thank you for that. Moving on. Tough question and maybe too broad, and maybe there's no good answer, but would you qualify the Native American experience as a genocide?
It depends on how you use the word genocide. In the sense of comparing it to the Holocaust, a physical genocide, I would say no. It was never the intention of the United States government to physically annihilate Native Americans. There were massacres perpetuated, massacres on both sides. The massacres that occurred against Native Americans, American Indians, were almost without exception perpetrated by American militiamen, volunteer forces that were, kind of loosely disciplined, that really over which the U.S. government did not exercise the best of control. I'm thinking of, Sand Creek Massacre as an example. These guys were, were gutter trash. Basically, they were the dregs of their particular, frontier society. But the U.S. Army did not perpetrate massacres. If we had time, I would go into Wounded Knee and why I consider that to be a tragedy rather than a massacre per se. It was a battle, a one-sided battle, but it was not a massacre. But so there was not an intention to physically eliminate the Indians. There was a desire, and again, this is, of course, we have to think in terms of the beliefs of the day. There was even the greatest advocates of Indian rights believed that the American Indians had to change and become, quote, civilized and Christianized, unquote, in order to have a chance to survive against the millions and millions of Americans who were sweeping across the country. So there was definitely an intent at cultural genocide. Obviously, that terminology would not have been understandable to the people of the time, but there was a belief that the American Indian had to change his way of life in order to survive. And really, as tragic as it was, there is some truth to that, particularly in the West. When you look at a tribe like the Cheyenne, for instance, who never, after they were decimated by disease, like many tribes in the West were, during the historical period of which I write and which we associate with American Indian resistance to the United States during the 1800s, never numbered more than maybe 4,000 members, which then split into the Northern and Cheyenne tribes, separate tribes. But the Cheyenne, at the time of the Indian Wars in the 1860s, when they began in earnest, they claimed as their hunting land, as their own, the better part of what today is the western half of Nebraska, the western half of Kansas, eastern Colorado, southern Wyoming, and even a bit of Oklahoma and the Texas Panhandle. Now, there's no way that 4,000 people, regardless of whether they were, of what their ethnicity was, could continue a way of life on that large and expansive ground when you literally had millions of immigrants, moving westward. It just wasn't tenable. And unfortunately, despite the best of intentions that many in the government did have, again, within the context of the time, they were, advocating a cultural genocide, what they believed to be the only way the Indians could survive. But nevertheless, they placed them on reservations that were not conducive to farming. They frequently cheated the Indians out of their annuities, out of what was promised to them, and never kept to treaties in terms of the amount of land that they would give the Indians. They were constantly renegotiating treaties and decreasing the amount of land. And that was, that was inevitable. It was almost really hypocrisy on the government's part to say, okay, we're going to give you X amount of land, knowing that with the increase of immigration into the United States, the growing population, that there's no way that these small tribes. I mean, the largest tribe in the West, for instance, was the Lakota or the Sioux. The number no more than 20,000 could ever, be expected to be able to maintain nearly all of Montana, Wyoming, and the Western Dakotas as theirs exclusively. It just wasn't feasible. But the government certainly didn't do its part to integrate the Indians into larger society. And for their part, Native American tribes, parts of them were resistant to integrating, and the government attempted it too fast. I mean, you couldn't, I couldn't expect the tribes to suddenly become like their American counterparts. It just wasn't realistic. So there was an intended cultural genocide, but the belief, naive though it may have been, I think, was well intentioned for its time. Certainly better than, say, the Australians treated the Aborigines in Australia. But there was never an intended physical genocide. So I hope I've made that kind of division, clearer, and especially in the context of the time.
Thank you. We have 3 more questions in the chat box, so let's see if we can get through them.
Sure.
First one is, I see there's a Shawnee Nation group in Oklahoma. Is this the same group as Tecumseh's or an offshoot? And were you able to interact with them in your research?
These Shawnee are a combination of Shawnee groups. You have the Shawnee who migrated voluntarily beginning in the 1780s into what was then Spanish territory, and the Spanish were very generous in granting land to Indians that would come west to occupy it for 2 reasons. One, because they could never get enough Spaniards to settle in that country, and it was thinly populated, and they needed Indians from east of the Mississippi to settle it to combat the tribes of the West in order to help them keep that land. And so you have the Shawnee descendants of those voluntary immigrants, along with those who remained east of Mississippi in modern day Ohio right up until the 1830s, when they were essentially forced westward and joined the Shawnees in the West and became a separate nation. Did I interact with them? No. That's a conscious decision on my part, and I think most historians tend to do greater or lesser degree what I do, because I try to rely on contemporaneous sources to the greatest extent possible, because quite honestly, I found in some interactions I had with Apaches and others in writing The Earth is Weeping, that while there's not an intent to distort the historical record, you find that there's a tendency, even among the tribes today, to remain to a degree factionalized between groups within tribes who accommodated with the Americans early on and those who opposed the Americans, who fought the Americans. So history is Indian oral history is really no more reliable than any other oral history. And so I try to look at the contemporaneous records that were left, particularly records of that Native Americans left of their culture and their religion and their society at the time. And I think that is the most reliable way to look at it. Obviously, in many cases, it was filtered through translation but I think it's still fairly reliable, and I have gotten nothing but good feedback from Native Americans whom I've dealt with and with my books. And in fact, during the resistance to the pipeline in Dakota, Native Americans cited "The Earth is Weeping" and an article I did for Smithsonian Magazine as source works to show how their land was taken from them illegitimately by the United States and U.S. government.
Thanks, Peter. Next question. Did you visit the Prophet's grave? Apparently, it's on private property in the Kansas City area.
Yes, I did. It's in what is now Kansas, the edge of Kansas City, Kansas, in a residential neighborhood. It's really quite poignant. Tenskwatawa, again, I guess I'm hope I'm not spoiling the story, but I guess I'm giving a bit of a little bit of spoiler alert here. He ended his days as part of that forced migration to what is modern day Kansas, and in his declining years, his followers were limited to just his immediate extended family and a few other people, and he tried to recreate Prophetstown in this natural hollow beside a natural spring on what was then Shawnee Reservation ground, and it has now become, again, it's now private property, but the owners have maintained it as it was, and the natural spring and the hollow in which Tenskwatawa spent his last years of his life is still there, and it is considered sacred ground by the Shawnee and other tribes who do go and leave offerings there. And part of that land has been taken by the state of Kansas and a memorial put up. But it's really quite poignant, to see that where Tenskwatawa, who at one time was the moving spirit behind a movement that, again, not only attracted adherents from all across the Midwest, but even, and this I didn't get a chance to get to in my talk, but I do in my book, also adherents from among the Indians, particularly the Creek Indians in the American South. He went from that to a little community of 4 or 5 wigwams in this natural hollow on the periphery of the Shawnee Reservation, very much withdrawn from his own people, even later in life. But it's really a poignant, tragic, in some ways even more tragic conclusion to his life than that of Tecumseh, who, at least when he died, he was at the height of his power, and he did not have to live to witness the gradual decline of the Indians of the Midwest and the rather than the more abrupt decline of his alliance.
Thank you. And we'll wrap up with a slightly more contemporary question.
Sure.
What do you think of the recent court ruling in favor of Indian rights to a large part of Oklahoma?
I have to say that my knowledge of that isn't sufficient for me to comment any more intelligently than anyone else. I'm a historian, and I really don't track modern Native American affairs as well as perhaps I should. I'm kind of gleeful about it. I think that the tribes that are involved, the Creek in particular, and again, my next book, the working title of which is Red Sticks and Old Hickory, the Creeks, Andrew Jackson, and the Brutal War for the American South, deals with Andrew Jackson and how he became the famed character he was, and the Creek War, which was the most brutal Indian war in American history, and really which opened up the American South to opened up Alabama, Eastern Mississippi, and Western Georgia to the Cotton Kingdom. It only came to exist because of the defeat of the Creeks. and to see really the Creeks, the Cherokees, and the other of the four so-called civilized tribes that by the 1830s had largely assimilated, seeing them forced on their various trails of tears out to Oklahoma. This is a reprehensible episode in our history. The Choctaw Creek, Cherokee and Chickasaw, see them forced out into what is now eastern Oklahoma, and lose so much of what they had. I think it's nice to see their rights being somewhat at least recognized today. So what little I do know of it, I'm happy for it. Considering the raw deal that they got in the 1830s from Andrew Jackson and the U.S. government in their forced relocation.
All right, thank you very much, Peter, for spending time with us today. We greatly appreciate it. Thank you, Maria, for moderating, and to Ambassador Rubin for playing host. Thank you all for attending, and we hope you'll join us at our next event. Thank you all.
Thank you, everyone, for attending, and thank you for the great questions.
Thank you.
Okay, take care now.